I wanted to talk to you.
Mm.
I'm back at school and I'm doing a master's in fine art,
Right.
and the stuff that interests me most and I'm concentrating on is video and installation-y type stuff,
Yeah.
and primarily around the subject of time, and in particular, missing time that just seems to go, that's there and gone. And so
Right.
I've interviewed all kinds of people. You'd know some of them: designers, directors, artists, playwrights, a couple of philosophers. And then I'm like, what the hell? I should be talking to Alistair, because he is an expert in watches and has written books about it, and he must have an opinion about time.
Right.
And so I thought I'd ask you. Oh, I spoke to a physics professor too,
All right.
which was really interesting because I went in thinking I maybe knew 0.5% about
yeah.
what time might be to a physics professor.
Yeah.
And I came out realising that I know nothing.
Yeah, and how we perceive time is very different, isn't
Yes.
it? To the theory
Yes.
of it.
Yes, that was really interesting. So I want to ask you, what is time?
What is time?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good one. I've thought about this because it's pretty interesting. It's quite interesting that you're doing this. I tried to go back to education a number of times and looked at a few courses like that. But time, well, I remember discovering that if you lose yourself in a book, time goes away.
Yes.
And when I worked with you, I was commuting a lot.
Yeah.
And when I discovered that I was wasting time during my commute, hour and a half probably.
Yeah.
And when I was first working with you, my commute was 2.5 hours.
Oh my God, where were you living?
Well, I got started, and my brother was he was I don't know, 5th year in architecture.
Yeah.
Down in Kent, just outside Dartford. There's an architecture school there.
Okay.
And I knew them, and they went, oh, well, I popped in, I had an interview on Thursday, and they went, okay, you can start Monday. Well, I didn't live in London. So I moved, got back home, got all my stuff, and then moved to Kent.
Got you.
And then got the, intercity, the Dover train into Covent Garden. And I started work. So once I'd worked out how it all worked in terms of the commute, I was like, wow, this is like 2 hours I'm losing. And is there a more efficient, quicker way of doing it? You know, the way everyone's obsessed in London with, how did you get here? And the Biff and the boys, all from Kent, gave me loads of advice about saving time. And, I come into Victoria, and then I would, go all the way down to the tube, because it's very deep there.
Yeah.
Which would take a lot of, just that staircase would take a lot of time. So I was timing myself constantly. And it would be Victoria Line to Green Park, where you've got to go down another flight of stairs, very deep, and then Piccadilly Line to Covent Garden, which is then a lift up, which is a lot of time.
If it's working.
If it's working. Maybe it was the wooden one as well in those days.
Yeah.
And I remember, I kept my mouth shut and, just trying to find out what's going on and this, that, and the other, and, and I just come back from driving a VW bus to Egypt. Well, we didn't actually make it to Egypt because Syria was shelling Lebanon. And then literally 6 weeks later, I'm starting in London. And I was quite young. I was only 19.
Yeah.
And the idea was, well, he's from the north, and what does he know? And I was like, fine, I don't mind. I was very familiar with London. been to London a lot. So I was trying to work out how everything worked, and what I realised was commuting in time was a big deal. So it started off with people saying, how'd you get here? And I was like, oh, I live... And the Kent boys were like, oh, you don't want to do it that way. You can save time. So it started off with them saying, if you're going to get the tube, get off at Leicester Square, because it's just round the corner and you can walk it. That's going to save you Leicester Square to Covent Garden and the lift. Yeah. Right? So my first saving of time was that. Mm-hmm. And then a few weeks later, I got into a conversation, and I think it was Biff actually, and he said, you get the tube from Victoria. You can get a bus for Victoria. That'll save you even more time. So come out of Victoria, come out of off this platforms, turn right, there's a little arch, go through there, there's a bus stop 24, goes along Victoria Road to Parliament Square, around and up Whitehall. Right. So I started doing that, which saved time again. And then finally, when it was very warm, I suddenly realised you can walk it in 20 minutes. Right? And I shaved about half an hour off my journey. Yeah. By realising I could just do that. And then it was, well, it's still bedtime. So I'm looking out the window. I can't really, there was all those nightmare stories of people commuting where they get on a train and end up in Dover because they fell asleep. Yeah. And there was always a worry. And that was true. I was actually on a train coming to Victoria when a guy suddenly jumped off my shit. And he'd been on the train since the very early train. So he'd already gone to London and back and gone again. Oh, my God. Yeah. It was hilarious. You used to see things like this. It's one of those community stories. Yeah. So he definitely lost some time. And so what I realised, what I started doing was I always read a lot. And so I was paranoid of, I went to a faded grammar school. Yeah. That, everyone patted me on the head because I'd gone to this very famous school. And then it turns out that it was actually a terrible school. So I was, slightly paranoid about education. So I read like crazy. And what I realised with reading while I was commuting was the time actually disappeared. So the time of my commute, instead of it being walk to the station, overland all the way into London, bus, tube, however I could make it 5 chapters of a book. Oh, that's a nice way of thinking of it. Yeah, and that's what I did for the whole time I was in London.
I like that. It's really interesting that you started that talking about Complete, because one thing about Complete I always found was when we were working, we were obsessed with 25ths of a second. Yeah. And, if you just think about the layout of a clock, how precise it is, and you have countdown here and then black and then picture starts but no audio, and then audio joins it and then audio finishes earlier. But do you know what I mean? That there are very precise rules about how time is recorded. Yeah. And yet working at Complete was frequently the biggest waste of time. Do you know what I mean? Like, you'd look at the schedule and you go, oh, great, we're going to be done at 9 tonight. And then at 1 a.m, you're still there and someone's dicking around trying to make a fancy clock or something. Yeah. And you're like, what? What? Well, this is my time that someone's, that people are taking and well, we were kind of bending time. Because what we were doing was we were measuring our work in time as a concept, but time was going on separately. Yes. To the time that we were using. Yes.
And also, our version of time was more accurate than time.
Yes.
Because no one says, what time is it? And you say 12, half past 12 and 12 frames.
No.
You know what I mean? Nobody, and I mean, a lot of stuff I did, I couldn't actually explain to people. So I didn't tell people what I did for a living after a couple of years. I would just say I would invent jobs, really, because they would ask me dumb questions, and often quite pointed dumb questions. And it would just lead to, I'm going to have to spend 20 minutes explaining to you how it all works so that you understand what I do. And also, you'll be intimidated by it, and therefore we won't communicate properly.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to waste that time either. Well, I think we're doing what we did with the whole measuring of time, as you say.
Yeah.
It gave us an acute awareness of there's everyone else's time, and then there's our time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point.
If you were to think about even just like one episode of a game show, so an ITV one, so 26 minutes in those days.
Yeah.
All right, 26 minutes on telly. How many person hours went into making that? From planning it, researching it, finding the people to go on it, the studio time, all the people who are involved in that, the edit time. I mean, it's just a vast amount of time, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the edit, the problem with post-production, even though we were extremely accurate at what we were doing, it didn't take as much time as the actual production process.
Yeah.
Or cost as much.
No.
So our time wasn't valued, I didn't think.
Nowhere near as much as production time.
Yeah, which I didn't really understand until I did a few shoots myself.
Yeah.
But then we were pretty snotty. Yeah. I became quite efficient. The linear, because I'd never really understood the concept of linear thinking.
Yeah. But
doing what I ended up doing made me think incredibly linearly, and to be very good at managing time and efficient. And I would go on shoots and just look at it and think, this isn't a very good example of managing time correctly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people standing around. You haven't made your decisions yet. You haven't tested your decisions. And I found the production process to be, compared to what we did, because I'd been tempered as someone who paid attention to the time I was using, I thought they were extremely inefficient.
And sometimes, like you say, because they were ill prepared, you could just see that what they thought was going to be X in post was actually going to be 3 times X, because they hadn't done their homework.
Well, none of them had.
No.
And when I freelanced, I worked for quite a lot of big people, big places, both in London and abroad. And I dropped out of the big ones because I was like, I've had enough of this. And it was a bit of a nightmare because it got worse. Because you had people who were like, if I get a Harry, I can make a load of money.
Yeah.
As opposed to, if I get a Harry, we need to be really fucking good.
Yeah.
So I would have phone calls, whereas I never did a job under 4 hours. Mm-hmm. Because there's no job under 4 hours.
No. People would book, remember people would book an hour or something. You're like, what are you going to do in an hour?
Yeah, I know. And I remember particularly doing something, I think it was on something called Space Precinct, or one of these things, where there was a company called XTV who were based, I think they were I can't remember. They were in Covent Garden anyway. And they had Harry, and they were all ex-broadcast guys from Thames. And they got me to do some freelance stuff for them. And they were like, well, our engineer, if you press this button, this will be correct. And I was like, this is going to waste a lot of time. I mean, my whole thing was, you do, without putting the right time in at the beginning, you will waste a lot of time.
Yes.
And I remember them saying, we got this job, it's 2 hours. And I just said, I don't do jobs under 4 hours. They don't exist, because you'll end up going in and, to do your 2 hour job, and it'll take 4 hours. So then we'll argue about the money and all the rest of it. So, and I remember them calling me once and saying, we got this thing, blah, 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 can you come in and, it's 2 hours. And I said, who's quoted it as being 2 hours? And they were like, we have. And I'm like, okay. And I had the same conversation. And I said, I can't do it, because it'll just, and I think I had another job on at the time. And they were like, no, we're only going to pay 2 hours, £100. Right? And I was like, fuck off. £100 for what? So they then called me the next day and said, okay, we'll pay you the 4 hours. So I get there, and I was in town anyway. I had a mobile, so it was all very new. And I popped in, and they'd already had someone come in to do this job, and who had wrecked it. And I looked at the job, and I was like, okay, well, this would have taken 4 hours if you hadn't already, and they'd mastered it over the original. And I said, so this is now going to take 6 hours at least. And the conversation, their idea of time was just money.
I agree with you. That is entirely what happened to production, post-production. People's initial idea and what it was going to take and the money available were like 3 different islands that very few people was talented enough to link up and properly work out beforehand. So they had their wish list, their budget, and then time, and mostly they did not correlate at all.
Well, what they needed to do, they needed to look at success at one end, and money at the other.
Yes.
And then it's the space in between. How do we get the space in between filled? They're too literal. They just saw time as money. Because if they weren't so bossy or messed me around, then I go and an editor can make it 6 hours, or he can make it 4 hours.
Yeah.
And even though another editor would go, oh, he's really overrun this, they don't always know. Someone like Tony or Andrew or Jamie Russell would know, but hardly anyone else would.
Yeah.
Because hardly anyone was actually very good.
Yeah.
And the problem is that our idea of our jobs in those days, we did think of it in terms of time. But what we didn't realize is we were working with the best people that existed.
Yeah. We were very lucky.
Yeah, I don't think we knew how good everybody was, really. Mm-hmm. But there was a conscientious attitude to time, which went out the window. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes.
Well, you can't work somebody to death. But we need the money, and we book the time. And then the clients would be, well, you're charging us for this. It's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And it's like, yeah, but it's really difficult what we're doing. I don't think the very good high-end ones understood that our time was valuable.
Yeah.
Because of what we could do for them. And, sometimes you'd, if it was 7 hours, you might book it as 5 because you were being kind, or, and just be civilized. Well, that idea, the bit of grease between one thing and another, that as an editor you had, oh, don't worry about that, or I'll just do it again, I'll do you another version and things like that. That started becoming time that we weren't charging, and then the attitude between the client and the job became combatant, I thought.
Oh, definitely, more and more so as budgets got tighter, and there were more and more people at agencies because there was more and more content to make, and because there was more and more stuff, the people they had were less good, and
Well, you guys weren't as technical as we were, and we could patronize if we wanted to. Mm. But you were miles more sophisticated than anyone I worked with afterwards. It was just salespeople after that.
Yeah.
But they were obsessed, if we're talking work, really, they were obsessed with time because they just saw it as the dollar value.
Totally.
When I worked in Hong Kong, it was mad again because they really didn't know what they were doing. I mean, they really didn't know what they were doing. And the amount of cock-ups they made on jobs, even though when you told them, and they were all like, well, we've got to save time because we've rented these lenses and we've got to get them back by... they were all on... they were all leasing equipment, but it was all based on bonuses.
Yeah.
So if we get it done quicker, we could pay less. And I was like, yeah, if you're any good, you could do that. But even anyone was any good would not do that because it wastes time.
Yep.
Try doing a difference match shoot.
Oh, my God.
And they're using gels on the lights. So the gels are melting and they're replacing them constantly.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Oof.
And then you try and put them together to create, the difference match it all. Using a motion control rig. With Jackie Chan, it was the biggest job they'd ever done, and I was doing it. And I was, and it took double the time. Because they were measuring the time in money they could save.
Yeah.
Instead of measuring the time and doing it properly.
Yes, it's the tasks that needed doing.
Yeah.
Just switching the subject slightly.
Yeah, do that, because otherwise I'll just refer to...
No, watches.
Mm-hmm.
When a watch goes fast or a watch goes slow, where's that time gone?
Well, it's technically not... It's only going fast or slow relative to the time period we're thinking of.
Yes. Because
a watch movement, because it's the movement.
Yeah.
It's just a mechanical object. Even if it's running slow or fast, it's still doing its job.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, because its job, it's like a train. If a train's late, it's not really the train's fault.
Yeah.
Because the train is, if it's running, then it's doing its job. And that's what a watch movement does. It's correct for what it is. A load of cogs working together that starts with a full wind off the mainspring, and then it only ends when the mainspring runs out of wind.
Yeah.
But it's how we need it to display time. But the movement itself is working. So when people I have endless conversations with people about watches where they'll call me and say, it's not keeping time. And I'll say, okay, it's not keeping time, or you're not. There's a couple of things. Are they monitoring time? I.e., to test the watch movement, that it's working properly, you put it on a little machine that listens to it, because all movements have a registered beat.
Oh, wow, like a heartbeat.
Yeah. So, and it's part of their specification. So if you buy one of the most produced watch movements ever is by a company called ETA, and it's called a 2824. And it's an automatic three-handed watch, i.e. just a regular watch.
Yeah.
And it can have a date, and it's automatic. And its beat rate is 28,000 beats per minute. So what you do is you get this little electronic machine that has an earphone, and you put it on the earphone, and then you go to the little display, and it says, what do you want me to listen for? And you put 28,000 beats per minute. And then it'll tell you, listen to the movement running. You wind the movement. You get it rolling for a couple of minutes so it's efficiently working. And then you put it on the little, it's like an ear, and then you put it on it. And it'll listen to it, and then it'll tell you plus or minus what it's running at. So that isn't measuring time.
Not in the way that we automatically recognise time,
yeah.
But it is measuring. It's measuring a different form of time, isn't it?
It's measuring an efficiency of a mechanical object.
Right.
Watchmakers do not talk about time.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
They never talk about time because it's irrelevant. Here's another thing. You take a watch apart, right? Take the hands off it. Take the crown and stem out, which is, what the winder. That frees up something that is connected to the movement from outside of the case. You then undo some what they call movement screws, which is this little frame inside a watch case that holds the movement in place. You unscrew that, and the movement comes out. The movement comes out, and it has a dial on top of the movement and hands on top of the dial. Take the hands off. You take the dial off. The dial fits in onto the movement with two pins where holes are drilled into the movement. So the dial drops these they're called dial feet, into these little holes, which puts the dial in about the right position, but it has a little bit of play in it. And the reason why it has a little bit of play in it is if you drop the watch on its side and it has a lateral shock, the play will prevent the dial feet from being sheared off. Right?
Right.
Yeah, so this idea that watches are like, movements are incredibly accurate, but watches are a load of things put together that are very accurate, that have to have movement in them, because otherwise the mechanics of putting a watch together are largely about not transferring the massive shock of dropping it onto a tile floor all the way through the case and all the way through the movement. So here's an interesting one. I once was offered an Omega watch from the 60s, chronograph. Same movement of the watch that went in the Moon watch. And it was a Seamaster version of it. Mm-hmm. And it was quite a lot of dough because it was quite rare. And I said, I was offered several watches by this dealer in London. And I said, well, my watchmaker needs to look at them. And he said, well, I'll just send them. So he sent them with a courier. My watchmaker, who lives around the corner, called me and said, I dropped them off, and he calls me the next day and he said, do you want to come in for a minute? You go, oh, I went, yeah. So I'd pop in and bring a couple of coffees and we talk about, whatever I brought in. And he said, this watch has been hit so hard from the side that the movement has compressed laterally. So the round movement, you've seen them. You know what they look like.
Yes.
It was slightly oval.
Oh, my God.
By about 0.5 millimeter. And so that was compressing time.
Oh, crikey.
And I said to him, well, does it work? He went, yeah. It's running to a chronometer spec, which is like, plus or minus 5 seconds a day. And I went, okay, is that a problem then? He said, if anything ever happens to this watch, as soon as you take one of these parts out, the whole watch will effectively disintegrate. It's, what did he couldn't come up with a word. He called it its credibility.
So it's under tension in a way.
It's all under tension. Wow. But with a little bit of flexibility so that a shock is not easily transferred. It dissipates as it transfers. The shock wave transfers from one part to the next part to the next part because there's a tiny amount of play in them.
So that one had used up its flexibility and some.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what it had done. Because if you, as an example, this is how watchmakers think. Your watch has let some water in, right? Mm-hmm. The most common thing that happens to people. And what they do is they say, well, I think it's the crown. So I'll just take it to a watchmaker and get him to change the crown. Watchmaker won't do that. Because what happens is all he does is change the crown. But what he knows is there's a leak somewhere. And that means that the little rubber rings that go on the case back when you screw it in, they go around the crystal when you put that in. Mm-hmm. They're all there to waterproof the case. And if you can't change them all and then test it for its waterproof ability, he won't do it. Because what will happen is he just changes the crown, watch leaks again. It's on him now because he was the last guy that had it.
Yeah.
Right. And so all they're actually interested in doing is guaranteeing the mechanical the mechanical outcome that a watch movement can provide. So they don't see it as time. They see it as a machine. Interesting, right?
Yes, that's the most extraordinary and interesting, and the way you've explained it, kind of obvious.
Yeah, it's completely the opposite.
Yes,
of how we view them.
Yes.
So, like when you spoke to me and you asked me about watching, you were thinking of watches to get this. Can you imagine what a drop in the ocean that is to me?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to work out, people, you asked me a question like that. I'm thinking of buying a friend a watch. My first thought is, well, what budget have you got? What do you need it for? Do you want it to look flash? Do you want to show off?
Yeah.
Do the numbers have to be big because their eyesight's poor?
Yeah.
Does it need to be waterproof because they swim in the morning?
Yeah.
There's a million questions to be asked, and none of them are about
time.
Does it need to tell the time correctly?
Yeah.
Watchmakers, even when I speak to them, just look in the air when you speak to them. Because unless you speak their language, you're asking them questions, but they're actually trying to find out about you. They're a bit like a priest.
Right.
But the main thing, I can talk endlessly about this stuff because I've been very fascinated by it. Or fascinated by it. But the main thing is they never talk about time. Because for them, it's never efficient enough. No watch is 100% correct. Mm-hmm. None. Atomic watches, maybe. But even they are only accurate to a decimal place. That is beyond anything we can perceive. So therefore...
Seems accurate.
Yeah. It's good enough, essentially. And so when somebody rabbits onto you about their watch and how it's a marine chronometer, it was tested by the Swiss in Geneva, and it's still not correct. And also, 365 days in a year isn't correct either.
No, I get that.
So time is a load of relative concepts in a load of relative fields.
Yeah.
They're all floating along a baseline of because time is going on while we're doing all these things. But it's not our time.
No. Well, yes. Well, that's what's so interesting, isn't it? Is that it's, despite everything we think, we don't really have control over it.
No, not at all. And the other thing is, we can look out the window for a minute, and then we look back, and it wasn't a minute; it was like 10 minutes.
Yeah, or if you're in the gym and you're telling yourself that you're going to do 20 minutes on the elliptical, and you look down and you think, I must have done 7, and you've done 1.5.
Yes, that's another one. That's another very good one about measuring time. Mm-hmm. Because I've done a lot of sports stuff, and I've done a lot of gym work and stuff, and I can't stand it, really. I like playing games, really. And I blew a disc in my back playing softball about 10 years ago. And I had to, when you do anything to your lower back, all your muscles switch off so they don't stress it. You have to go through a program of reactivating them. Mm-hmm. And then you have to do loads of core work, right? Yeah. For stability and the rest. Like, you really have to do it, because if you don't have the strength, it means you can't control your bowels and stuff like that. So it's quite serious. My understanding of how I perceive time while under stress is completely, while under stress at a gym, is completely different to how I perceive time in any other way. Yeah. It went slower.
Oh my goodness, so much slower.
Mm-hmm. And although I was doing this, it was like 2.5 hour workout. Very, you have to do this, then you do that, then you do this, and you don't go higher than this with this weight, and all this kind of stuff. It's exactly the same as anyone else going to the gym, because we all have the same common feeling. Like you said straight away, you think you've done 7 kilometers and you've done, or 7 minutes and you've done more. Yeah. Or you think, and then there's time, your perception of time over distance. So get on a bike and try and do 10K in under 12 minutes. And that's unbelievably difficult. You're like, I've only done 5K. Really? Yeah. Yeah. Because in a gym, it's a controlled testing environment. You're not on a road where you're thinking, there's lights, this car wants to overtake me. All the things that would distract you from your internal clock measuring time. So you have to just realize it goes a lot slower than you thought it did.
Like waiting for Bennell to finish.
Mm-hmm. Well, luckily I didn't work with Terry Bennell very much, so but it was just the same, different guy, same thing. I mean, there was a lot of that. Yeah. But there's a lot of poor perception of time, and then kids come along and you've just reached your 30s or whatever, and you're pretty patient. I mean, I'm really patient. And a lot of that came from training that I got to complete. And then suddenly you've got something that's got no patience at all.
Oh my God, yeah, tell me about it.
And it's like, shit, how do I deal with that? And then that's emotional patience and emotional time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Hey, I've got to run. That was brilliant, and I'm really, really grateful to you for that. I'm going to give you a call another time just to catch up on other things. All right, because that was really...